It all started in the hospital room. The sterile white walls, the quiet hum of medical machines, the faint scent of antiseptic. Everything seemed routine until I saw that glance. Jennifer was lying on the hospital bed after a minor accident, and I was standing by her side, offering comfort. But when Dr. Grayson walked in, something shifted. His eyes lingered on her for just a second too long, and she, my wife, looked back with the same intensity. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe I was overreacting, seeing something that wasn't there. I had no reason to doubt Jennifer. We'd been married for 8 years. She was the mother of my children, the woman who shared my life. But that moment, that subtle exchange of looks, planted the seed of suspicion deep in my mind. A few weeks later, it was all she could talk about. "Dr. Grayson is amazing," she would say. "He's so attentive, so professional." I didn't think much of it then. After all, people praise their doctors all the time, right? But the way she said his name, with just a hint of admiration, made my stomach tighten. Jennifer started making more frequent trips to the clinic. Routine checkups, she'd say. Follow-ups from the accident. Yet the visits grew longer, and she became more secretive. One evening, she came home late, reeking of a scent that wasn't hers. A musky cologne, one I recognized from the hospital room, Grayson's cologne. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do. While she was in the shower, I grabbed her phone. My heart pounded as I scrolled through her messages, hoping and praying that I wouldn't find anything. But there it was, a message from Grayson. "Looking forward to seeing you again." There was no explicit content, nothing that would scream affair, but the tone, the familiarity, told me everything I needed to know. They were more than just doctors and patients. I confronted Jennifer that evening. I tried to keep calm, to hold back the rage building inside me, but my voice trembled as I asked her, "Is there something going on between you and Dr. Grayson?" She hesitated. That brief pause, the flicker of guilt in her eyes, was all the confirmation I needed. She didn't deny it outright, but she didn't admit to anything either. Instead, she danced around the question, deflecting, avoiding eye contact. That's when I knew she was hiding the truth. That night, as she slept next to me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be the passive, forgiving husband. I wasn't going to walk away quietly, leaving her to run off with him. No, I was going to destroy them both. Grayson had crossed a line, and he needed to pay. I spent the next few days researching everything I could about medical complaints, malpractice lawsuits, and how doctors could lose their licenses. It didn't take long to discover how vulnerable they were to claims of misconduct. All it took was the right evidence and the right set of documents. And I could make Grayson's career disappear. The thought of ruining him excited me. It wasn't enough to simply confront them, to expose their affair. I wanted to take everything from him, his reputation, his livelihood, his future. Jennifer didn't know it yet, but I was about to turn her world upside down. At that moment, lying in bed beside her, I wasn't just the betrayed husband anymore. I was something else. I was vengeance incarnate, and the first step of my plan was already in motion. The more I thought about it, the clearer everything became. Jennifer had been slipping away from me, little by little, and I hadn't even noticed. I'd been blind, distracted by work and the daily grind, too trusting to see what was happening right in front of me. But now, the mask had been pulled off. I could see her for what she was, and him, too. Over the next week, Jennifer's behavior became even more erratic. She'd leave early for errands that lasted hours and come home late from supposed appointments with Grayson. Each time she came back, her excuses were thinner, her explanations more hollow. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Maybe she thought I was too oblivious to notice, or maybe she just didn't care if I did. I needed proof. Real proof. Something I could use not just to confront her, but to ruin him. So, I followed her. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I tailed her to Grayson's office. She didn't notice me as she walked through the clinic doors, her eyes darting nervously around the parking lot. It wasn't a normal checkup. I knew that much. I parked across the street, watching as she disappeared inside. My heart was pounding in my chest, anger and anxiety swirling together in a sickening cocktail. I waited for what felt like hours, trying to calm myself down, trying to keep my mind focused on what I had to do. When she finally came out, her hair was tousled, and she looked disheveled. The look on her face was one of relief, but it wasn't the kind that comes from a clean bill of health. It was the kind that comes from indulgence. I clenched my fists so hard that my knuckles turned white. I had seen enough. That evening, I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I sat her down, feigning concern, and asked her about her day. She gave me the same tired lies: errands, work, doctor's appointments. She smiled through it all, acting like everything was normal, like she wasn't betraying me behind my back. The more she talked, the more I wanted to lash out, to scream at her, to tell her I knew everything. But I didn't. I wasn't ready to strike just yet. After she went to bed, I spent hours at my computer, gathering everything I could on Grayson. He was well respected in the medical community, had been practicing for over a decade, and had a pristine record, not even a hint of controversy. That only made it more satisfying. He had so much to lose, and I was going to take it all away. I crafted a plan. If I was going to destroy him, I needed more than just rumors of an affair. I needed something that would make the medical board sit up and take notice. I spent the next several days fabricating evidence. Fake patient complaints, emails detailing inappropriate conduct, and even falsified medical reports showing negligence. Every detail had to be perfect. One slip up and the whole thing would fall apart. But I was meticulous. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. As I worked, I kept up the charade with Jennifer. I acted like everything was fine, like I hadn't seen her walking out of Grayson's office, like I didn't know she was spending her afternoons wrapped in his arms. It was harder than I expected, but I had to stay calm. I had to make sure she didn't suspect anything. Finally, the day came when I was ready. I submitted the complaint to the medical board anonymously, attaching all the evidence I had created. It was airtight. If they even suspected for a moment that Grayson had crossed any lines, it would be enough to open an investigation. And once they started digging, his career would be over. The waiting was the hardest part. Weeks passed without a word, and I began to wonder if maybe it hadn't worked. Maybe the board had dismissed the complaint as baseless. But then, one evening, Jennifer came home looking pale and shaken. I asked her what was wrong, feigning concern. "It's Grayson," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's being investigated for misconduct." I acted surprised, shocked even. "What kind of misconduct?" I asked, knowing full well what she was about to say. "He didn't say much," she replied, her voice trembling. "Just that someone filed a complaint. They're saying he's been inappropriate with patients, that he falsified records." I nodded sympathetically, but inside, I was smiling. My plan was working. Grayson's perfect little life was starting to unravel, and Jennifer had no idea that I was the one pulling the strings. As she talked, I could see the fear in her eyes, the growing realization that the man she had been sneaking around with might not be as untouchable as she thought. The cracks were starting to show, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing came crashing down. And when it did, I would be there to watch it all burn. The days after Jennifer told me about the investigation were some of the most satisfying I've ever had. Every time she talked about Dr. Grayson, I could see the cracks in her confidence, and the growing fear that her affair was spiraling out of control. She didn't know I was behind it all, that I had orchestrated the entire thing. To her, it was a freak accident, a terrible coincidence. I let her believe that. I let her sit in that quiet, festering guilt. A few weeks later, the news got worse. Grayson was suspended from his practice pending a full investigation. The clinic was abuzz with rumors, and Jennifer was in a state of near panic. She hadn't been to see him since, but I knew she was still in contact with him. I could see it in the way she stared at her phone, waiting for his messages, the way she bit her lip when I asked if something was wrong. She didn't tell me the full story, but I didn't need her to. I knew exactly how this would unfold. The medical board would dig into his records and investigate every aspect of his career, and my fabricated evidence would lead them straight to the conclusion I wanted: that he was a fraud, a danger to his patients, and a disgrace to his profession. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Jennifer started withdrawing. She became more distant and less talkative, like she was carrying a heavy burden but didn't know how to release it. She hadn't confessed anything to me yet, but I could see the guilt gnawing at her. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about the consequences. She was watching the man she had thrown everything away for losing everything himself, and she couldn't stop it. One night, as she sat quietly on the couch, staring blankly at the television, I decided to probe further. "How's Dr. Grayson?" I asked casually, not taking my eyes off the screen. She didn't answer immediately, but after a long pause, she said, "Not good. He's being investigated for misconduct. It's serious. I'm sorry to hear that, I replied, keeping my tone even. Inside, I was anything but sorry. She shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. He didn't do anything wrong, you know, she added defensively. It's a mistake. Maybe it's a misunderstanding, I offered, letting the conversation hang in the air. But I knew it wasn't a misunderstanding. I had made sure of that. As the investigation dragged on, Grayson's life continued to fall apart. His patients started leaving the clinic, and his reputation in the community was tarnished. Jennifer became more and more distraught. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that her lover wasn't the knight in shining armor she thought he was. He was vulnerable and fragile, and now he was losing everything. And she had bet her future on him. By the time the medical board officially revoked Grayson's license, his life was already in ruins. The announcement came as a shock to the medical community, a respected doctor. Now disgraced, accused of falsifying records and inappropriate conduct. It was exactly as I had planned, every piece falling into place with surgical precision. Jennifer didn't speak to me much after that. She stayed in her own world, trapped in her own guilt and confusion. I pretended to be supportive, asking her how she was holding up, offering her comfort that I knew she didn't deserve. Every time she looked at me with those guilty eyes, I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. She had no idea the extent of my involvement, no idea that I was the one who had torn her perfect little fantasy apart. I watched her as she stared at her phone one evening, waiting for a text or call that would never come. Grayson was finished. He had no more influence, no power to save her from the mess she had willingly stepped into. I knew it was only a matter of time before she broke. And she did. It was a cold Friday night when Jennifer finally crumbled. She had been quiet all day, barely speaking, her face pale and drawn. That evening, after dinner, she sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. I could see the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but I didn't offer a word of sympathy. I need to tell you something, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I acted surprised, though I had been waiting for this moment for weeks. What is it? I asked, my tone soft, as if I didn't already know. I've been seeing someone, she confessed, her voice cracking. It's Dr. Grayson. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to happen. I didn't mean to hurt you. I stared at her for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air, pretending to absorb the weight of her confession. In reality, all I felt was a cold, calculated satisfaction. This was what I had been waiting for, her acknowledgement of the betrayal, her admission of guilt. But it wasn't enough to simply hear her say it. She needed to understand the full scope of what she had done. I know, I said, my voice steady. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. You know? I've known for a while, I replied. I've seen the way you've been acting, the way you talk about him. I knew something was going on. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I did it. I was stupid. I stood up, walking over to her slowly, my voice calm and measured. You weren't just stupid, Jennifer. You were selfish. You threw away everything we had. For what? A fling? A fantasy? And now look where it's gotten you. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her lips trembling. Please, I'll do anything to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes. But there was no making it right. Not now. Not after everything I had done to set this plan in motion. It's too late for that, I said coldly. Grayson is finished. He's lost his license, his career, his reputation. And now, you've lost me. Her face crumpled as the full weight of my words hit her. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging for forgiveness, but I felt nothing. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. I'm filing for divorce, I told her, my voice hard and final. You can stay here for now, but we're done. As I walked away, leaving her sobbing at the kitchen table, I felt a strange sense of closure. My plan had worked perfectly. Grayson was ruined, Jennifer was left with nothing, and I was free. Free from the lies, free from the betrayal, free from the weight of her deceit. I had won, and as I closed the door behind me, I felt nothing but satisfaction. The days after Jennifer's confession were eerily quiet. It was as if the house itself had absorbed the weight of her betrayal. She walked around like a ghost, eyes hollow, shoulders slumped as if the life had been drained from her. I didn't talk to her much, and when I did, It was only about practical matters, bills, scheduling, the kids. Emotionally, I had already checked out. I was waiting for the next phase of my plan to unfold. I had filed for divorce a few days after the confrontation. The papers were sitting on the dining room table, waiting for her signature. She stared at them for hours but never picked up the pen. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the hope that maybe I'd change my mind, that maybe there was some way to fix what she had shattered. But there was no fixing this. Jennifer hadn't gone to see Grayson since his license was revoked, but I knew she still thought about him. I could see it in the way her gaze would drift off. Lost in thought, the guilt etched into every line on her face. She had sacrificed everything for him, and now he was gone. She was left with nothing, no lover, no career, no respect. And soon, she would have no husband. But that wasn't enough for me. Not yet. One afternoon, I received a call from a private investigator I had hired weeks earlier. I didn't need him to dig up dirt on Jennifer, I already had all the proof I needed. No, I hired him to watch Grayson. To see how far the man would fall. I wanted to know every detail, to savor every moment of his collapse. Grayson's putting his house up for sale, the investigator told me. Looks like he's trying to get out of town. I smiled at the news. Of course, he was running. His career was over, and his reputation was ruined. He couldn't show his face in the community anymore, not with the cloud of scandal hanging over him. He was desperate, scrambling to salvage whatever remained of his life. But I wasn't finished with him yet. That evening, I told Jennifer about Grayson's situation. I didn't even have to bring it up directly. I casually mentioned that I had heard he was selling his house and that he was leaving town. The look on her face was priceless, a mixture of shock, sadness, and resignation. She knew what it meant. Grayson wasn't coming back. He wasn't going to be there to pick up the pieces of her broken life. She had bet everything on him, and now he was abandoning her. She tried to act like it didn't matter, like she had already moved on. But I could see the pain in her eyes. She had lost him, just like she had lost me. And it was all her fault. As the days passed, Jennifer's state of mind deteriorated. She was anxious and jumpy, like she was waiting for something terrible to happen. And I made sure it did. I leaked the details of her affair to a few carefully chosen sources. Mutual friends, neighbors, people in our social circle. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. Soon, everyone knew. The whispers followed her everywhere she went. At the grocery store, at the kids' school, at the gym, people stared, gossiped, judged. She was no longer just Jennifer, the wife and mother. She was the woman who had destroyed her marriage for a disgraced doctor. It was exactly what she deserved. The final act of my plan came sooner than I expected. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Jennifer sat me down at the kitchen table. She looked worn out, drained of all the energy she used to have. There were dark circles under her eyes. And her face was gaunt. She looked like a shadow of the woman I once knew. "I can't take this anymore, Dan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The guilt, the stares, the whispers. I'm drowning in it. I've lost everything. I know I deserve it, but I can't live like this. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her words, to understand that this was the culmination of every decision she had made. She had done this to herself. "What do you want me to say, Jennifer?" I finally asked, my voice cold and measured. "You made your choices. You chose him over me, over our family. And now you're facing the consequences." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. She had cried enough. There was no more forgiveness left in me. "I know," she said, choking back a sob. "But I'm begging you. Please, please don't destroy me completely. I'll sign the divorce papers, I'll leave, I'll do whatever you want. Just, don't keep punishing me." There it was. The final plea. The last desperate attempt to salvage some shred of dignity. "I'm not punishing you, Jennifer," I said, leaning forward. "You did that all on your own. I'm just letting you live with it." She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking with the weight of everything she had lost. I stood up and left the room, leaving her alone with her regret. There was nothing more to say. She had burned our life to the ground, and now she was standing in the ashes. The next day, Jennifer signed the divorce papers. There was no fight, no negotiation. She accepted the terms without argument, knowing she had no leverage. She moved out of the house a week later, leaving me with full custody of the kids. She didn't have the strength to argue that either. She knew she had no right to them, not after what she had done. As for Grayson, the last I heard, he had left town for good. His house sold, his practice dissolved, and his name was nothing but a stain on the medical community. He had been erased, just as I had planned. In the end, I had everything I wanted. Jennifer was gone, Grayson was destroyed, and I was free from the lies and betrayals that had poisoned my life. I had rebuilt myself from the ashes of their affair, stronger and more focused than ever before. But as I stood alone in the empty house that once held so many memories, I realized something. Revenge, sweet as it was, came with a cost. I had won, but in the end, there was nothing left to celebrate. In the weeks after Jennifer moved out, the house felt like a tomb. The once familiar sounds of laughter, conversation, and life had disappeared, replaced by an unsettling quiet. I had achieved what I set out to do. Jennifer was gone, Grayson was ruined, and I had full custody of the kids. But as I moved through the empty rooms, the weight of that silence began to press down on me. At first, I relished the solitude. It felt like a victory, like the calm after a storm. I could breathe without the stench of betrayal choking me. But soon, that calmness turned into something else, something darker. The kids spent a lot of time at their grandparents' house, which left me alone, often for days at a time. I'd come home after work to an empty house, eat dinner in silence, and go to bed with only the sound of the ticking clock keeping me company. One night, I sat on the couch staring at the blank television screen, a glass of whiskey in hand. It had become a ritual: drink, sit, think. The revenge had been sweet. Yes, watching Jennifer crumble, and seeing Grayson's life dismantled, it had all been exactly what I wanted. But now, with no more moves left to make, I started asking myself a question I hadn't thought about before: now what? I had spent months planning, calculating, and executing my revenge, but I hadn't thought about what came after. My marriage was over. The life I had built with Jennifer was destroyed, and despite everything, a part of me missed her. Not the version of her who had cheated, but the woman she used to be, the mother of my children, my partner, the person I had loved for so many years. I took a long sip of whiskey, letting the burn chase away the regret that was starting to creep in. I had won, but it didn't feel like victory anymore. It felt like I had burned down the entire world around me and was now standing alone in the ashes. A month after Jennifer had left, I received an unexpected message. It was from her. She wanted to meet. At first, I was tempted to ignore it. There was nothing left to say. But something about her tone, the desperation in her words, made me agree. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, far enough away from anyone who might recognize us. She looked different, thinner, more fragile, as if the weight of the past few months had drained the life out of her. She was nervous, her eyes darting around the room as if she were expecting someone to attack her. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly, her voice weak. I nodded but didn't say anything. I wasn't here to make her feel better. Jennifer took a deep breath and looked me in the eye. "I know I have no right to ask for anything after what I did. I destroyed our family, I betrayed you, and I'm living with that every day. But I need to talk to you, about everything." I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to relive the nightmare of her affair, or her excuses, or her apologies. But something in me told me to let her speak. So I did. She hesitated, struggling to find the words. "When I was with Grayson, I didn't see it for what it was. I thought I was in love with him. I thought he could give me something you couldn't. I know now how wrong I was. He wasn't worth it. He never was." There was no satisfaction in hearing her say it. I had already taken away everything she had valued. Hearing her admit to her mistake felt hollow, as if it was too late to mean anything. She continued, her voice shaking. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't expect that, but I need to know. Why? Why did you destroy him like that? I know you hated me for what I did, but him? Wasn't it enough that I lost everything?" I met her gaze, my expression cold. It wasn't enough. He had to lose everything too. He took what was mine. He deserved it. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she was going to break down again. But she held herself together, nodding slowly as if she had expected this answer. "I guess I deserved that too," she whispered. "But the truth is, I've lost more than just him, Dan. I've lost you, I've lost our family, and I've lost myself. I don't know how to fix any of it." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. But I couldn't let myself feel sorry for her. Not after everything. I had moved past sympathy. I had built walls around myself so high that not even her tears could break through. "I don't want to fix anything," I said, my voice flat. It's done. It's over. You made your choice. Jennifer wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. For everything. I loved you, Dan. I still do, in some twisted way, even though I know I've ruined any chance of us ever being together again. I sat there, listening to her apology, feeling nothing. Maybe that was the real victory. The fact that I had moved beyond caring, beyond the hurt. I didn't need her love, her regret, or her apologies. I had broken her, and now I was free from her grasp. I'm moving out of town, she said after a long silence. I think it's the only way I can start over. Maybe someday, you'll forgive me, even if I don't deserve it. I didn't respond. I didn't owe her anything anymore. As she stood up to leave, she gave me one last, lingering look. Take care of the kids, she said softly, before turning and walking out of the cafe. I watched her go, feeling the final chapter of our lives closing behind her. She was right. She didn't deserve forgiveness. Not from me. But as she disappeared from sight, I realized that maybe I needed to forgive myself, for letting it go on this long. For letting revenge consume me, and for allowing it to hollow me out. Jennifer was gone. Grayson was ruined. But in the end, I had destroyed something in myself too. I left the cafe, stepping out into the cold evening air, unsure of what came next. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time, the possibility of moving on. The war was over. Now it was time to figure out what came after the battle. The days stretched on, each one quieter than the last. With Jennifer gone, there was nothing left to remind me of the chaos that had once engulfed my life. The house was eerily still, like a monument to the battles I had fought and won. But with every passing day, I found myself questioning what exactly I had won. I had destroyed Grayson's career, his life, and ultimately, his relationship with Jennifer. He had vanished from the city, taking with him the smug arrogance that once fueled my rage. And Jennifer, well, she was gone too, moving out of town like she'd said. She was no longer my concern, no longer a part of my life. Yet, for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I had always imagined that when this was over, I'd feel a sense of relief, a kind of triumph. Instead, what I felt was a deep, gnawing emptiness. The revenge that had once consumed me had burned out, leaving only a hollow shell where my satisfaction should have been. I thought about my kids, how they were adjusting, how I was adjusting. I had done all of this for them. To protect them from the lies and betrayals that had torn our family apart. But in the end, was I really the better man? I started throwing myself into work, filling my days with meetings, calls, and anything to distract me from the silence of the house. But at night, when everything was still, the weight of it all came crashing down. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a graveyard of memories, our family dinners, the laughter of my kids, the late nights with Jennifer when we used to talk about our future. It was all gone. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey in front of me. I poured a glass, staring into the amber liquid, trying to find some kind of answer in its depths. But there were no answers. Just more questions. Was it worth it? Was the revenge worth the price I'd paid? I thought about Grayson, where he was now, what he was doing. Did he think about me? Did he even care about what had happened, or had he moved on with his life while I was still stuck in the ruins of mine? I had no way of knowing. But I couldn't help but wonder if I had given him too much power over me. I had let his betrayal consume me, and now that it was over, I was left with nothing but the ashes of my anger. The next morning, I woke up with a dull ache in my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. Regret. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I had gotten what I wanted, but at what cost? I had let my obsession with revenge poison everything. My relationships, my peace of mind, my sense of self. And now, there was nothing left but the consequences of my actions. Weeks passed, and the emptiness persisted. I had built my life around revenge, and now that it was gone, I was left to pick up the pieces. But life, as it tends to do, kept moving forward, whether I was ready or not. The kids needed me. They were my anchor, the only thing that kept me from spiraling further into the void. They were adjusting, but I could see the cracks. They missed their mother, no matter what she had done. And while I couldn't forgive her, I couldn't deny that she had been a part of their lives. A part of mine. One afternoon, I picked up the kids from school, and my daughter, Lily, asked me something that caught me off guard. "Dad, do you think Mom is okay?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with the innocence only a child could have. She didn't understand the depth of what had happened between us, and I wasn't sure how to answer. For months, I had been so focused on my own pain, and my own need for revenge, that I hadn't thought much about how this had all affected her. "I'm sure she's okay," I said, forcing a smile. "She's just trying to figure things out like we are." Lily nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She missed Jennifer, and no amount of revenge could change that. It was at that moment that I realized I needed to do something I hadn't been willing to do before. I needed to let go. The next day, I made a decision. I called Jennifer. She answered after a few rings, her voice hesitant. "Dan, I think we need to talk," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Not about us, but about the kids. We need to figure out how to move forward for their sake." There was a long pause on the other end, and I could almost hear the weight of her guilt in the silence. "You're right," she finally said, her voice soft. "I've been thinking the same thing." We agreed to meet at a neutral place, a park where the kids could play while we talked. It wasn't easy seeing her again. Part of me still felt the sting of her betrayal. But another part of me, the part that had begun to heal, knew that it was time to move past it. As we sat on a bench, watching the kids chase each other around the playground, Jennifer turned to me. "I know I can't undo what I did," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I know I'll never earn back your trust. But I want to be a part of their lives, Dan. They need both of us." For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity. I had been so consumed by my need for justice, for revenge, that I had forgotten about the most important thing, my children. They were the only ones who truly mattered in all of this. Jennifer had hurt me, but she was still their mother, and they deserved to have both of us in their lives, even if we couldn't be together. "I know," I said, my voice steady. "We'll figure it out." For them, it wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a step forward. And in that moment, I realized that maybe moving forward didn't mean forgetting or forgiving. Maybe it just meant finding a way to live with what had happened and making the best of what was left. As I watched Lily and my son, Ethan, play together, I felt something shift inside me. The bitterness, the anger, the need for revenge, it was still there, but it was no longer consuming me. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was beginning to move on. Jennifer and I would never be what we once were, but that was okay. Life had changed, and it was time to let go of the past and focus on the future, not just for me, but for the kids. They deserved that much. And maybe, just maybe, I did too. As the months passed, things started to fall into a new rhythm. Jennifer and I settled into a co-parenting arrangement, exchanging the kids on weekends, and keeping conversations civil but distant. We were doing it for them, for Lily and Ethan, and while it wasn't perfect, it was the best we could manage under the circumstances. The anger that once consumed me had dulled, no longer sharp and burning, but always lurking beneath the surface. Despite everything that had happened, life went on. The kids were adjusting to the changes, and work kept me busy enough to avoid dwelling too much on the past. But there were moments when the weight of regret would hit me, sudden and heavy, as if it had been waiting in the shadows, ready to remind me of the things I'd lost. One evening, after a long day at the office, I came home to the empty house. The kids were staying with Jennifer that night, and the quiet felt suffocating. I poured myself a drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the fading light. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but it felt distant, like a scene from a life I no longer recognized. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old photos, family vacations, birthdays, random moments of laughter caught in time. There was one picture that stopped me cold. It was from a few years ago, at Lily's 5th birthday party. Jennifer and I were standing side by side, arms around each other, smiling as Lily blew out the candles on her cake. We looked happy, genuinely happy, before everything had gone wrong. Before the affair, before the lies, before the revenge. I set the phone down, and the image burned into my mind. There was no going back to that time, no undoing what had been done. But I couldn't help wondering what might have happened if I had handled things differently. If I hadn't let the need for revenge consume me. If I had tried to fix things instead of tearing them apart. I stood up and walked through the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Every room held memories, fragments of the life Jennifer and I had built together. The living room, where we used to sit and talk for hours. The kitchen, where we'd cook dinner together, laughing as we tried new recipes. The bedroom, where we had once shared our hopes, our dreams, and eventually, our secrets. As I walked through the empty house, I realized something. I wasn't just mourning the loss of Jennifer or the betrayal that had shattered our marriage. I was mourning the man I used to be. The man who had believed in love, in trust, in a future that no longer existed. But that man was gone, and in his place was someone I barely recognized. A man who had let bitterness and vengeance define him. A man who had destroyed not just his wife's lover, but himself in the process. I found myself standing in front of the mirror in the hallway, staring at my reflection. The man who looked back at me was tired, worn down by months of anger and regret. The lines on my face were deeper, my eyes darker. I didn't look like the person I used to be, and maybe I never would again. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel something other than anger. I let the regret wash over me, acknowledging the pain I had buried under layers of bitterness. I had spent so much time focusing on revenge, on making Jennifer and Grayson pay, that I had forgotten about the most important thing, myself. I had lost a part of who I was in the pursuit of revenge. And now I had to find a way to reclaim it. But how? I didn't know the answer to that question yet. I wasn't sure if I ever would. But standing there in the quiet of the house, I made a promise to myself, I would try. I would try to move forward, to rebuild, not just for the kids, but for me. Because if there was one thing I had learned through all of this, it was that revenge could only take you so far. It could give you momentary satisfaction, a fleeting sense of justice. But in the end, it left you with nothing but emptiness. And I was tired of feeling empty. As I turned away from the mirror and walked back to the kitchen, I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more nights like this, more moments of regret, more times when the weight of everything I had done would feel unbearable. But I was still standing. And that, at least, was a start. Maybe that was the first step toward healing, accepting the mistakes, the pain, and the regret, and choosing to keep moving forward. No matter how hard it was. I poured myself another drink, but this time, I didn't drink it. Instead, I dumped it down the sink and turned off the lights, leaving the house in darkness as I headed upstairs to bed. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to start over. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to take it. The days had settled into a predictable routine. Work, the kids, the moments of silence when the house was empty. It all became a sort of numb comfort. But that numbness was shattered one Friday afternoon when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone and the kids were staying with Jennifer that night. When I opened the door, I was hit by a wave of shock. Grayson stood on my porch. I hadn't seen him since the day the scandal had broken. The last time we had crossed paths, he was being led out of his office in handcuffs, the weight of his disgrace hanging heavy in the air. He had vanished after that. No one had heard from him, and part of me thought I'd never see him again. I had no idea how he'd found me or why he was standing here now. His appearance had changed. The confident, charming doctor I once despised was gone. He looked older and thinner, with dark circles under his eyes and an air of defeat about him. "Dan," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "Can we talk?" I stared at him for a long moment, my mind racing with a mixture of emotions, anger, disbelief, confusion. What could he possibly have to say to me now? Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him to go to hell and never come back. But another part of me, the part that had started to let go of the rage, felt a strange curiosity. "What the hell do you want, Grayson?" I finally asked, my voice cold. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, looking down at the ground. "I know I've ruined a lot of lives, including my own. But there's something you need to know. Something I didn't have the guts to say back then." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Go on." He took a deep breath and looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. "It wasn't just about Jennifer. Yeah, I was selfish, and I let things get out of control. But I was never trying to ruin your life. I never set out to hurt you. He paused as if searching for the right words. "I was lost, Dan. I was a mess. And Jennifer, she was just part of the chaos I created." I felt a flicker of anger, but it wasn't as sharp as it once was. "So, what? You came here to make peace? To absolve yourself?" Grayson shook his head. "No, I don't expect that. I needed you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. I don't know if that makes a difference, but I needed to say it." I stood there, staring at him, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He wasn't the man I had hated all these months. He wasn't the villain I had built up in my mind. He was just a broken man, standing on my porch, asking for a shred of redemption. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I thought about the pain he had caused, the way my life had been torn apart because of his affair with Jennifer. But I also thought about everything I had done in the name of revenge. I had destroyed him, utterly and completely. I had gotten my justice. But standing here, looking at him, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. Maybe you are sorry, I said finally. But it doesn't change what happened. Grayson nodded, accepting my words. I know, and I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just wanted to face you, man to man, and own up to my mistakes. We stood there in silence for a moment longer before I finally said, "You've owned up. Now go." He hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Take care of yourself, Dan. And I hope you and the kids find peace." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. I watched him go, feeling a strange sense of closure. The man who had once been the center of my hatred was gone, and I was left standing there, wondering if this was the last chapter of our tangled story. I closed the door and stood in the quiet of the house, realizing something important. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at him, not at Jennifer, and not at myself. The weight I had been carrying for so long had finally started to lift. The months rolled on, and with them, the slow, steady process of rebuilding my life. I didn't know it at the time, but that conversation with Grayson had marked a turning point. His visit had stirred something in me, a sense that it was time to let go of the past once and for all. One Saturday afternoon, I was with the kids at the park. Lily was running around with her friends, and Ethan was climbing the jungle gym with a look of intense concentration on his face. I sat on a bench, watching them, feeling a sense of contentment I hadn't felt in a long time. Jennifer was supposed to meet us later that day. We had managed to find a rhythm with the kids, a way of co-parenting that, while not perfect, worked for all of us. We weren't friends, there was too much history between us for that. But we were civil, and we were doing our best for Lily and Ethan. And that was enough. As I sat there, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jennifer, running late, but I'll be there soon. I smiled to myself. Late, as usual. Some things never change. I leaned back on the bench and closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the sun wash over me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about the past. I wasn't dwelling on the betrayal, the revenge, or the pain. I was simply present, here in the moment, with my kids. And that was all that mattered. When Jennifer arrived, she walked over to where I was sitting and gave me a small smile. "Hey, sorry I'm late." "It's fine," I said, gesturing to the kids. "They're having a good time." We stood there for a moment, watching Lily and Ethan play. It was a peaceful scene, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel awkward between us. It just felt normal. Jennifer turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "You seem different, Dan. Lighter, somehow." I shrugged. "I guess I've just learned to let go of a lot of things." She nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm glad. You deserve some peace." We didn't say much after that, but we didn't need to. The past will always be there, a part of our story. But it didn't define us anymore. We had both moved on, in our own ways, and that was enough. As the afternoon wore on, I felt a sense of hope creeping back into my life. Not the kind of hope that everything would magically be perfect, but the quiet, steady kind that told me I could handle whatever came next. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I was ready to face it. Because sometimes, after all the pain and the heartache, all the betrayal and revenge, life gives you a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to take mine. The day of the divorce was bright and deceptively cheerful for what it meant. Jennifer and I sat in the sterile, lifeless courtroom, the judge reading through the formalities as if our entire life together was nothing more than a stack of papers. We had been through so much: years of love, kids, betrayal, and the quiet unraveling of our marriage, and now it was being wrapped up with the flick of a pen. I thought I'd feel more during this moment, maybe a resurgence of the anger or the bitterness that had once driven me. But as I sat there, listening to the legal jargon and the finality of the process, I felt strangely calm. The judge asked us both if we understood the terms, if we were satisfied with the arrangements for the kids, and if we were ready to end it. Jennifer glanced at me briefly before answering. Her eyes didn't carry the weight they used to. She, too, seemed ready to let go. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Yes," I echoed. With that, the divorce was finalized. There were no dramatic speeches, no outbursts. Just a quiet acceptance of what had already been true for months now: our marriage was over. As we left the courthouse, Jennifer and I walked side by side, not saying anything for a while. The air between us was different now, lighter in a way. We had been through the worst of it. The affair, the lies, the fallout, it was all behind us. All that was left was the closing chapter, and with it, a strange sense of peace. When we reached the sidewalk, Jennifer turned to me. "So, I guess this is it." "Yeah," I nodded. "I guess it is." She hesitated, then smiled softly. "You know, Dan, despite everything, I'm glad we had our time together. We did some good things. We have 2 amazing kids." I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no resentment. She was right. Whatever mistakes we had made, whatever hurt we had caused each other, we had still shared years of love and had built a family together. "I'm glad too," I said, meaning it. There was a pause, the weight of finality hanging between us. But instead of sadness, I felt something else: relief. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't hate Grayson or myself. The rage that had once consumed me had finally faded into something softer, something I could live with. Jennifer took a deep breath and glanced down the street. "Well, I better get going. The kids will be home soon, and I don't want to keep them waiting." "Yeah," I agreed. "I'll see you around. We'll make sure to keep things smooth for them." She smiled again, a real smile this time, and for the first time in a long while, I saw the woman I had once loved. Not the betrayer, not the source of my pain, but just Jennifer, the mother of my children and a part of my past that I could look back on without bitterness. "Take care of yourself, Dan," she said. "You too." We shared one last look, a quiet acknowledgement of all we had been through and all we had let go of. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the city crowd, and leaving me standing there on the steps of the courthouse. I watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. But mostly, I felt free. Free from the weight of the past, free from the need for revenge, free to move forward with my life. The sun was still bright in the sky, the world carrying on as if nothing monumental had just happened. But to me, this day marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of something new. As I stood there, I realized I wasn't afraid of what came next. I didn't have it all figured out, and I wasn't expecting life to be perfect from here on out. But I had made it through the worst, and I had learned something important along the way. Letting go wasn't about forgetting or absolving. It was about choosing not to let the past define me. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I could rebuild. I could move forward. I turned and walked away from the courthouse, my steps feeling lighter with each one I took. This wasn't the end, it was just the start of something new. Months passed after the divorce was finalized, and the pieces of my life began to fall into place. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had learned to navigate the days with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. The kids were adjusting, and Jennifer and I kept things civil, focusing on what was best for Lily and Ethan. It wasn't easy at first, but time had a way of softening the rough edges, even the ones I thought would never fade. I found myself in a new apartment, a smaller place but cozy, just big enough for the 3 of us on the weekends. The walls weren't covered in memories like the old house, and in a way, that was a relief. This was a fresh start, a space I could make my own without the weight of the past looming over me. One Saturday morning, Lily and Ethan were playing in the living room. Their laughter filling the apartment with a warmth I hadn't realized I was missing. I watched them from the kitchen, sipping my coffee, and for the first time, I didn't feel that familiar pang of regret. Instead, I felt something else: gratitude. Despite everything that had happened, we were still a family. Different, yes, but still together in our own way. Later that day, as we headed out to the park, I noticed the kids were more at ease. They were no longer asking awkward questions about why things had changed or whether mommy and daddy would get back together. They had accepted the new reality, and in doing so, they were teaching me to accept it too. At the park, I sat on a bench, watching them run around, playing tag with the other kids. A breeze picked up, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass, and I leaned back, letting the calm settle over me. Jennifer arrived a bit later, waving at me as she approached. We had been doing this for months now, meeting up at the park, exchanging the kids, making sure we were both part of their lives in a way that felt stable. It had taken a lot of work to get here, but we had managed. We weren't the same people we used to be, and our relationship was forever changed. But it worked. "Hey," she said, sitting down beside me on the bench. "How's everything going?" "Good," I replied, glancing at the kids. "They're doing really well." Jennifer smiled, watching them. "Yeah, they are. I think they've finally adjusted." We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, watching our kids be kids, the way they should be. After everything that had happened, I didn't expect Jennifer and me to ever be this at ease around each other. But here we were, two people who had been through the worst, finding a way to coexist. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, Jennifer stood up. "I should probably get going. I have some work to catch up on." I nodded, standing as well. "I'll drop them off later tonight." She smiled softly. "Thanks, Dan, for everything. I know this hasn't been easy, but you've handled it well." I didn't know what to say to that. There was no manual for how to survive the collapse of your marriage, no step-by-step guide on how to deal with betrayal, loss, and starting over. But somehow, I had made it through. After she left, I gathered the kids, and we headed back to the apartment. As we walked, Lily grabbed my hand, swinging it playfully. "Daddy, can we get pizza tonight?" I laughed. "Pizza again? Didn't we just have it last week?" "Yeah, but it's so good," she exclaimed, her face lighting up. Ethan chimed in, "Please, Dad?" I couldn't resist their excitement. All right, pizza it is." That night, as we sat around the small kitchen table, eating pizza and talking about nothing in particular, I realized something important. Life had changed, in ways I could never have anticipated. But it hadn't ended. In fact, it was still unfolding, offering new chances, and new moments of joy. Jennifer's betrayal had once felt like the end of everything. I had spent so much time consumed by anger, by the need for revenge, that I hadn't seen the other side of it, the side where I could let go and rebuild, not just for the kids, but for myself. Now, sitting here with my children, laughing over pizza, I understood that this was my life. And it wasn't about what I had lost anymore. It was about what I still had. After the kids were in bed, I stood on the small balcony of my apartment, looking out at the city lights. The cool night air brushed against my skin, and I breathed in deeply, feeling more at peace than I had in a long time. This was it, the next chapter of my life. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what was coming next. I wasn't dwelling on the past or haunted by the choices that had brought me here. I was ready to move forward, to see what the future held, not just for me but for my kids. As I stood there, I thought about all the lessons this journey had taught me. About love, about loss, and most of all, about forgiveness, not just for Jennifer, but for myself. I had spent so long wrapped up in the idea of revenge, thinking it would bring me closure. But it wasn't revenge that had set me free. It was learning to let go. And so, with the city below me and the quiet of the night surrounding me, I closed my eyes and made a promise to myself, I would keep moving forward. For Lily, for Ethan, and for me. Because life wasn't about the pain of the past anymore. It was about the hope of what was still to come.